Thanks for coming, everyone. So let me just jump right in. So as we reach the final lines of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, we encounter something quite unexpected. The final lines are not Hegel's own. The book ends in a quotation from a poem by Friedrich Schiller. The poem is entitled Friendship, or Freundschaft, and you have the final stance of the poem on the screen right now. I'll say a few more words about it. And it is actually a misquotation, as you can probably immediately see. So on the left, we have German and English of the original Schiller poem, and on the right we have, in German and in English, Hegel's quotation, misquotation of the same poem. This is what you see at the very end of the Phenomenology. So it is a misquotation. Hegel introduces 4 alterations, and I was told that this has a laser function. So the alterations are, I mean, it's better if I show it in a German version, is, so this word, whole, disappears, and it's substituted by the deictic, dieses, this. Then Schiller substitutes Seelen, so the realm of souls, for the realm of spirits. I think in the science of marketing, this is called product placement, and let me claim that Hegel invented it. Yeah. And finally, so 2 more, the hyphen in Schiller's poem disappears from the Hegel's misquotation, and he substitutes the definite article die with the possessive pronoun seine, his. So what I will focus on mostly is the erasure of the hyphen from the very, very final line of the poem. The rest of Hegel's alterations are not insignificant, but they seem less interesting, and I think I'll be able to fold them into my reading kind of semi-automatically. Now, Hegel's concluding gesture opens into a whole host of questions. I think it's going to take me a while to adjust the microphone. Hegel's concluding gesture opens into a whole host of questions. Why end with a quotation? Why a poetic quotation? Why quote this particular poem by Schiller? Is Hegel's misquotation intentional, or does it stem from a kind of a failure of memory? Indeed, the entire closing paragraph of the Phenomenology in large part deals with memory. Tonight I'll likely address all of these questions to some extent. Ultimately, though, my goal is to explore how this misquotation functions as the culminating point of the Phenomenology, and in what way it fulfills the work's overarching program and project. Now, it's natural to look at the preface to the Phenomenology for a clear statement of the book's program, and indeed we find several such programmatic statements there. I would like to focus on the one in paragraph 5 of the preface, so very early in the preface. So, and this is the quotation, the first quotation on the screen. To participate in the collaborative effort at bringing philosophy nearer to the form of science, to bring it nearer to the goal where it can lay aside the title of love of knowledge and be actual knowledge, is the task I have set for myself. And I apologize for the formatting. Some of this didn't translate from my version of the PowerPoint to this one. Needless to remind you, the term philosophy comes from Greek roots meaning love and wisdom. So it originally signified the love of wisdom, the philia of Sophia, not merely or just knowledge or wisdom. And if we take Socrates' description of the love of wisdom in the Symposium, this is the second quotation here, which I'm not going to read, but I'm sure you're all familiar with it to some extent. If we take that description of the love of wisdom in the Symposium seriously, then love expresses a specific condition of lack that humans have toward wisdom. In short, we desire wisdom, or we love wisdom, precisely because we do not fully possess it. As an aside, Plato slides pretty freely between philia and eros in the Symposium, but for my purposes, I'll treat them as or as if equivalent. It seems then that Hegel's aim in the Phenomenology is nothing less than to overcome this very condition of lack. To put it bluntly, Hegel tells us, Let's stop desiring wisdom. Let's finally possess it. The aim then is really nothing less than to overcome philosophy, the philia of Sophia itself. And these may be the boldest lines, and the most arrogant lines even, in the entire history of philosophy. It's likely also important to remind you at this juncture that the German title of Schiller's poem Freundschaft may very well be translated as love. This is to say that in German, Freundschaft has a broader meaning than the English friendship. Much like the Greek term philia, it can frequently carry undertones at least approaching romantic love. Freundschaft can evoke a level of intense emotional, maybe even erotic, intimacy and depth that the English friendship probably doesn't fully capture. So Hegel's citation of Schiller at the end of the Phenomenology ties back to the preface's theme of overcoming the love of wisdom. By following the thread, I'd like to read the work as a whole as moving from the love of wisdom to wisdom itself. So in a way, all that I will try to convince you of tonight is that it is the same philia that Hegel has in mind in paragraph 5 and in paragraph 808. Examining how Hegel engages with the closing lines of Schiller's, let me call it Schiller's philia poem, alongside the 803 paragraphs situated in between, may shed light on what it means to leave behind the love of wisdom and to become simply wise. Now, 803 paragraphs is a lot of ground to cover. So I'll adopt a tactic inspired by the very structure of the phenomenology itself. It has been argued in various ways that Hegel's phenomenology is structured like a spiral. The spiral model that I am suggesting here is something like the following. Each of the 4 sections, so in the upper half of the screen, you have the full table of contents, the main divisions of the phenomenology from A to F, and then in the lower part of the screen, you have a kind of a, I'm zooming in on the subdivisions of the first 2 chapters or parts of the phenomenology, so A and B. Yeah. So each of the first 4 sections, A, consciousness, B, self-consciousness, C or AA, in some editions, reason, and then finally spirit, covers roughly the same ground, but at different levels. Yeah. Chapters equivalently sections 7 and 8, so that's religion and the final section, absolute knowing, aren't exactly outside the spiral structure, but their role is a bit more complex. So I won't really delve into those later sections much, mainly because most of us are not very familiar with them. So instead, I'll concentrate on the first 2 parts. So I'll undertake a roughly parallel or combined reading of the closing pages of The Force and Understanding. This is the final section of chapter A, consciousness, alongside the truth of certainty of oneself, or perhaps self-assurance, we could also translate it, which is in section B, self-consciousness. And in unfolding my argument, I will also be occasionally turning back to Hegel's introduction and the preface. My reading strategy is sometimes deliberately recursive, so not just from A to B, but also from B to A. The central problem of section B of the Phenomenology, if not of the whole book really, and I'll say a few more things about that, is the problem of mastery. That is, the quest for freedom or independence, understood in a very specific manner. Hegel's section on the master and servant should be read as an allegory, although I should mention it was almost certainly inspired by the very real Haitian revolution that was kind of going on as Hegel was working on the Phenomenology, and he was reading about it in the newspapers. Yeah. But it is chiefly an allegory of the attempt on the part of every self-consciousness to break free from dependence on other self-consciousnesses, plural, or even otherness more broadly, or most broadly. An attempt that, by necessity, Hegel will show, fails. In this light, section A of the Phenomenology could be read as a kind of epistemological prologue to section B. In section A, so that's consciousness, masters are not self-conscious biological agents, but master concepts. Concepts that claim a kind of immediate authority requiring no further justification. From perception to force and understanding, the idea, or rather from sense certainty to force and understanding, the idea of the immediate plays a decisive role. But as in self-consciousness, the B chapter, this project of mastery collapses. In both sections then, Hegel dismantles the fantasy of unconditioned authority. But I shall begin with section B. I shall treat the dialectic of lord and bondsperson as a prologue to what I've just described as an epistemological prologue that chapter A is. Okay, so this was the introduction. Okay, so I'm now returning. This is how the phenomenology ends, the first quote. And so before I jump to chapter B, self-consciousness, let me just pause very briefly on how Hegel frames his final misquotation of Schiller in paragraph 808. The sentence to which he appends Schiller's Philia poem is clumsy, pretty awful really, but my focus here is on a single term, the lifeless solitary. This phrase mediates between Hegel's text and Schiller's poem, I would suggest, whose final stanza, this was a few slides ago, whose final stanza stages the drama of a friendless master of worlds creating souls, spirits, to escape solitude. This phrase, then, the lifeless solitary, enables us to teleport ourselves, as it were, to paragraphs 166, 196 of chapter B, Hegel's allegory of master and servant, prologued by his explanation of desire, where mastery ultimately entails a kind of sterile self-enclosure, which in Schiller's poem acts for the friendless master as a spur to create another, or plural, others. Hegel's allegory that starts around paragraph 178, staged as an encounter between two self-conscious biological subjects, is prepared by two converging routes in paragraphs 166 to 177. So I'll briefly summarize those. So on the one hand, the very appearance of another self-consciousness poses an anomaly for the theory of desire with which Hegel opens the section. What does it mean for a self-conscious desiring being to encounter another self-conscious desiring being? More precisely still, what does it mean to satisfy one's desire in and through another desiring self-consciousness? This is Hegel taking up, in his own way, the ancient question of friendship. One cannot consume another self-consciousness as one would a non-human or better lifeless object. Not only would the other resist, which is, as we'll see what happens, but such consumption is self-defeating in the first place, since it eliminates precisely what one seeks, the other as a self-conscious desiring being. And so consumption in this context, I think, Hegel uses very broadly, so it includes sexual desire as well. So the model of desire, or how we ordinarily think about desire, must therefore be rethought when the object of desire itself desires, right? Or as one Hegel commentator, Kojev, puts it, when the object is desire itself, right? So in encountering another self-consciousness, it is really the question, right? And this is why I mentioned friendship a few seconds ago. It's a question of learning to desire itself. If the first path addresses the challenge, the first path leading to the dialectic of the master and servant, if the first path addresses the challenge posed by another self-conscious being from the standpoint of desire, the second path, Hegel's treatment of our animal natures in 168 to 174 paragraphs, sets the stage for what is distinctive about the human genos, the family or community of beings, each capable of saying I. For Hegel, to utter I is to claim authorship, responsibility for one's thoughts and actions, as he has it in 182, right, the second quote on the screen still. As he has it in paragraph 182, a self-conscious being is one for whom nothing exists of which it is not itself the origin. The implication that Hegel will draw from this is stark. Original beings unavoidably press against one another's original claims. The encounter of two such original desires is bound to give birth to a struggle. Hegel's life and death struggle is a distilled allegory of this very structural tension. I could not retrace Hegel's entire account of master and servitude, as it flows from the life and death struggle here, but I do want to single out what I take to be the chief deficiency of the master's position. The distinction between master and servant, Hegel tells us, hinges on who is able to scorn death. That is, who is able to assert, or better, as we ultimately learn, feign independence from the body and from life. Hegel's master acts as though self-consciousness, soul or mind, requires no material that is bodily support. A stance that appears impressive at first, but ultimately proves naive and untenable. The bondsperson, on the other hand, surrenders, pressed down by the felt necessity of his material existence, the dependence on life. Now, the master's position is untenable because it seals itself off from experience, the kind that Hegel treats in the introduction, and I will talk about this at more length in just a few seconds. So let me unpack this in stages. Hegel lays out the relation between master, servant, and what I will call experience straight away in 190, 196 paragraphs. The master positions the servant between himself and the independent thing, that is the otherness of the world, nature, if you will. As Hegel writes, this should be the first quotation, a very short one, the master relates himself immediately to the thing through the bondsman. The servant is thus reduced to the master's proxy. What the bondsman does is really the doing of the master, and that should be the second quotation, 191. In plain terms, the servant labors, the master bosses the servant around to satisfy his desires. Though the situation might initially seem favorable to the master, Hegel shows that the master ultimately occupies the losing position. Hegel contrasts the master's desire versus the bondsperson's desire. The desire of the master is pure enjoyment. It is therefore fleeting. The desire of the bondsman is, on the other hand, checked, held back, frustrated. In 195, Hegel describes this as work, or this is what frustration results in. Work is a formative action that educates, that amounts to a kind of learning. The bondsman materializes the concept, which is initially in his mind, in an object, for example, in a clay vessel. Or as Hegel phrases it, in Hegelese, as we might say, this is 195, that's third quote, the negative relation to the object becomes its form and something persistent. Yet this means that this is for good luck. This means that the bondsperson is compelled into the very process that Hegel elsewhere, in the introduction, I'm going to look at it in a second, calls experience. I've already hinted at this. So experience will be the activity of adjusting the concept to fit the object. This is kind of a gloss, and now let me go into more detail. Okay. So Hegel unpacks the logic of experience in the famously difficult paragraph 85 of the introduction. He begins by stressing that the split between in itself and for consciousness, between reality and appearance, is built into the very structure of human cognition. So it's a kind of distinction that ultimately all of us are familiar with. So Kant's famous example in the beginning of the dialectic in the first critique of the in itself straight rod that only appears for consciousness bent when it is submerged in water illustrates this very point. But let me quote Hegel at length here. So, however, the very fact that consciousness knows of an object at all already involves this distinction. To consciousness, something is the in itself, while another moment is the knowledge or the being of the object for consciousness. This differentiation is present at hand, and the assessment rests upon it. If in this comparison the two do not correspond, then it seems that consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. But in the alteration of the knowledge, the object itself alters for it too. For the existing knowledge was essentially a knowledge of the object. Along with the knowledge of the object too, along with the knowledge, the object too becomes another, for it essentially belonged to this knowledge. Hence, consciousness finds that what it previously took to be the in itself was not in itself, or that it was in itself only for consciousness. The most striking claim that Hegel makes here is that when knowledge is corrected, the object itself is altered. The object somehow does not remain steady in the readjustment of the concept. Hegel's view unsettles the familiar assumption that correction means substituting one belief about the object for another, while the object itself remains constant as a kind of a reference point. So for example, I might say that the sky looks green indoors, but outside it looks blue, but I presume, or the tie is presumed, unchanged. By contrast, Hegel seems to insist that experience always involves two objects instead of one. This is the second quote in 86, just to drive the point home. Hegel writes, we see that consciousness now has two objects. One is the first in itself, the second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. Hegel's analysis here is famously hard to follow, but the next paragraph gives us a useful hint for making sense of Hegel's two-object account of experience. In 87, this is the third one, and sometimes, you probably can't even see this on the screen, but so the first sentence of this entire quote is in a different color from the rest. And the reason why I'm doing this is that I will only read to you the first sentence, but I provide the full quotation just for context. Yeah. So in 87, Hegel remarks that this account of experience, right, that we've just run through, is in fact also the same sort of circumstance which was previously discussed concerning the relation of this exposition to skepticism. Right? So this allusion to skepticism helps us to, as it were, triangulate Hegel's position and test it against his earlier discussion of two forms of skepticism. So in 79, Hegel introduces skepticism in order to introduce his concept of determinate negation. The negation of the old form through which a new one arises. I'm paraphrasing. Hegel himself puts it this way. So not 79, 87, I think. One-sided skepticism always sees okay, maybe this quote is not actually on the slide, sorry. Let me just read it and then I'll approach what's currently on the slide. So in 79, Hegel introduces skepticism in order to introduce determinate negation. Here's what he says about skepticism. Kind of bad, one-sided, poor skepticism, as we're about to learn here. Skepticism always sees in its result only pure nothingness, and which abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is only the determinate shape of the nothingness from which it itself has resulted. However, it is only the nothingness which is taken as the nothingness of that from which it emerges, which is in fact the true result. That nothingness is itself thereby determinate and thereby has a content. So this is the logic one must carry into Hegel's two-object model. And by the way, no, this was the quote that I just read. It is on the screen. Sorry, it's just from this angle. Sometimes it's kind of hard to get lost in what I actually put on the slide. Okay, so this is the logic of determinate negation. I'll say a few words about it now. That we should carry into Hegel's strange two-object model. I'll give you an illustration. Imagine someone biting into what looks like a chocolate bar only to discover that it is a bar of soap. And this has actually happened to a family member of mine, but the example itself was, I should also give credit, is inspired by an example that one of the students in my seminar this year, Mr. Razamondo, provided. That example involved a piece of cheese that looked like a pear. So similar logic, but I thought, a bar of soap that looks like a chocolate bar is a little more fun. And this has actually happened here. So, experience will correct the error. That is, if you bite into the bar. Yeah? The object is soap, not chocolate. But the appearance that it seemed like chocolate is part of what the soap is. Here, negation is not formal, but determinate. And what makes determinate negation determinate is that the content is preserved via the negation, and so it is productive. In simpler terms, deception that this bar of soap deceived us, as it were, belongs to the object's truth. How the soap misled us is part of what the soap is. The soap's fragrance, or that it looks like something else, right? We learn that this is how soaps are made, or that there are soaps like this, right? This is what it means that negation is determinate. Deception is instructive, in other words. And as a quasi-aside, let me mention that this method of determinate negation is also the very method of the phenomenology, in variations across the text, but ultimately even in, say, the historical passage from Greek antiquity into what Hegel calls Rome's condition of universal servitude. He is borrowing Tacitus's descriptive term here. And it is precisely determinate negation that defines the procedure of science or experience for Hegel, a self-revising enterprise that advances by folding its own errors, corrected, into what it counts as true in itself. So it's a model of reason that grows by revision, as it were, that it's not static. And this is exactly the problem with the position of lordship. While the servant labors, the master condemns himself to appearances. The master denies himself access to, blocks himself from the mechanism that converts what is merely for consciousness into what is in itself. That mediating mechanism is labor or action. And I realize that this formulation is deceptively simple, and I will return to this point and outline what Hegel understands as the sort of action that alone frees the master for genuine experience, thought, and knowing. Now, we see this blockage that Hegel associates with the position of the Lord most clearly in what Hegel calls Stoicism, one of the three shapes of consciousness presented in the self-assurance section, right after the dialectic of lordship and bondage. While Stoicism develops out of bondage, though not literally, Hegel is probably just thinking of the Roman Empire and the kind of the renaissance of Stoicism in that period, really it represents another bid for mastery. It's a strategy for mastery, or of mastery. But it's a reduced discount form of mastery, as it were, equally available to the enslaved and their emperor. Where the allegorical master places the servant between himself and the otherness of the natural world, the Stoic instead places his own mind between himself and nature. Frustration is thereby redescribed as indifference, or frustration is turned into indifference by redescribing what happens. The Stoic is prepared for death, for the loss of kin or limb, on the ground that the mind remains untouched. For Hegel, even Kant's argument for the goodwill in the groundwork has the Stoic inflection. Kant's goodwill is good regardless of worldly consequences. That is, on Kant's part, a retreat into pure mental intending that is, as it were, immune from the frustrations of the world, right? This is what Hegel will tackle towards the end of the reason part of the phenomenology, right? So much later. Now, Kant actually escapes the full weight of that critique because of his theology. And Hegel knows it, which is why he circles back to Kant in the penultimate chapter of the spirit section. I will say a few more words about this later in my lecture. But it is worth noting now that in every major section of the phenomenology, so A, B, C, D, etc., Kant is always the final boss, as it were. Sometimes Hegel says it outright, sometimes it's more subtle, but Kant is always there. And this will be somewhat important for us in what follows. Okay, so Stoicism fails for the same reason that every form of mastery fails. It collapses into boredom. By boredom, Hegel means not a psychological state, or not only a psychological state, but the failure to generate real conceptual content for thought, the failure to know and to learn. Such is the dead end that comes from shutting oneself from experience in Hegel's sense of the term. Now, Hegel's unhappy consciousness is also boring. So the same problem will recur. It's boring and it's unhappy. And Hegel's unhappy consciousness provides the clearest example of mastery's failure, And for our purposes, the most helpful shape, it is the most helpful shape for seeing how the phenomenology will ultimately come to its misquotational close. And by now you've probably noticed that I am treating the whole self-assurance section, so lordship and bondage, unhappy consciousness, etc., as a kind of a principal motif for the entire symphony that the phenomenology is. So that's very much how I suggest we think about the book, at least for the purposes of my lecture. So let me begin then with Hegel's description of the unhappy consciousness, but I want to look at his description that is not actually contained in the unhappy consciousness chapter, but that comes right after that section, or that chapter ends, in the very first paragraph of the next C part, which is reason. So the first two sentences of 231, which is something like Hegel's summary of what has just happened in B, or at least in part of B. So 231, okay, that should be the second quotation on the screen. We read, consciousness has taken hold of the thought that individual consciousness in itself is absolute essence, and in that thought, consciousness once again takes an inward turn. For the unhappy consciousness, being in itself is the beyond of itself. So these are two separate, or if not separate, then separable claims. The first claim would fit the Stoic just as well as the unhappy consciousness, right? So this kind of inward turn, the mind is all that matters. But then, and this is the second claim, Hegel adds that for the unhappy consciousness, this essence, this is an important inflection, this essence is placed in the beyond, right? So think metaphysical, supersensible beyond. The strategy here is still recognizably one of mastery. The sovereignty of mind, secured against otherness, that defines Stoicism, is here strategically displaced into what in 177 Hegel calls the empty night of the supersensible beyond, which is crucially unreachable for thought. In doing so, the unhappy consciousness combines the stances of Stoicism and skepticism. And I haven't said much about this kind of skepticism, and I won't say much about it. I think all that suffices here is that, all that the unhappy consciousness borrows from skepticism is this judgment that the world is nothing but deception and falsehood. And that sort of opens the possibility of, as it were, another world, supersensible world, that is not deceptive and false. Now, to understand what Hegel means by this beyond, which figures very prominently in the shape that the unhappy consciousness is, we need to look back to the first A section of the Phenomenology, so the consciousness section, which comprises 3 chapters. So recall this little table of content that I provided in the beginning. So 3 chapters: sensuous certitude, perception, and finally force and understanding. And I'll be focusing on the 3rd chapter, and since it's not the chapter that we read in seminar, I've held off introducing it until now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the unhappy consciousness for a little bit, and I shall take a detour through force and understanding, and section A generally, before coming back again to the unhappy consciousness and then Hegel's final misquotational close. So section A of the Phenomenology, as I have suggested, is a meditation on epistemological mastery. It just means mastery in the business of knowing. The section is framed by 2 extremes. It stretches between 2 poles, as it were. On the one hand, sense certainty. On the other hand, force and understanding. These 2 chapters outline ostensibly opposed models of epistemological immediacy. And as I'll argue shortly, immediacy is functionally equivalent to mastery. In the sense certainty section, the immediate assumes the shape of brute facts, the non-inferential starting points of knowing. The understanding chapter, on the other hand, treats inferred concepts. And Hegel's examples range from Newton's force to Plato's ideas, as immediate, but only through a kind of sleight of hand which Hegel exposes as naive and transparent. It is by that sleight of hand that the beyond is introduced into metaphysics, right? And this is why I'm looking at that section, to kind of to see the mechanics of that introduction. So, this is how Hegel opens paragraph 90, which is the very first paragraph of the very first section of chapter A. So Hegel probes the framework of knowledge that claims as its foundation the immediate as such. We ourselves have to conduct ourselves immediately, that is, receptively. We therefore are to alter nothing in the object as it presents itself, and we must keep our conceptual grasp of it apart from our apprehension of it. This framework is appealing, right? This framework of immediacy, of pure receptiveness, because the immediate promises a foundation for knowledge. In Hegel, for Hegel, this is the this, the here, the now, that is immune to error or distorting mediation. Indeed, the driving impulse here is to banish the possibility of error. Whatever we claim to know must, on pain of an infinite regress, reduce itself to something immediately known. Now, what is immediately known is just as it appears, or what is immediately known, and I think this is an important kind of articulation of this logic, right, that's behind the appeal of immediate knowledge, which Hegel will show is unsustainable. Right? The point of immediate knowledge is that what is immediately known is just however it appears. So the lure of brute immediacy here is that the very distinction between reality and appearance, the distinction that corresponded to in itself for consciousness in Hegel's earlier account of experience in, say, 85. Yeah? When this distinction collapses, error seems to be excluded. This is also why the approach to the immediate has to be receptive here. Immediacy, by definition, excludes any active contribution on the part of the knower. The philosophical tradition before Hegel is full of examples of such immediacy claims. For example, for someone like Locke, sense impressions like red are immediate. I might be wrong about whether something really is red, but I can never be wrong about the fact that it looks red to me. Right? So reality-appearance distinction has disappeared, which is good. Or Descartes' cogito, which is also self-certifying and self-justifying, because as long as I think, I cannot evacuate cogito from my mind. Yeah. So again, appearance-reality distinction does not apply. And this is indeed what sense certainty for Hegel is after. Justifiers that are not unjustified, that require no justification, they are self-justifying. So in showing that there is no such thing as immediate knowledge, Hegel is really showing that there is no such thing as a self-justifying justifier in knowledge. Indeed, Hegel very quickly shows how this attempt at epistemological mastery collapses. The attempt to express the immediate always requires the universal. There is no this without that, no here without there. For Hegel, then, nothing is known apart from its connection to at least some other knowns. A whole battery of concepts, really. And such is, at the end of the day, also the central point of Kant's deduction of the categories. I'm citing here from the A deduction, this is the second quote on the slide, not the B deduction, simply because the claim here is stated most explicitly. So Kant writes, if every individual representation were entirely foreign to the other, as it were isolated and separated from it, then there would never arise anything like cognition, which is a whole of compared and connected representations. So in this cluster of concepts, or knowns, right, always a cluster, needed to make sense of experience, needed to have experience in the first place, some concepts are acquired inferentially, others are observed, say by our perception. Inferentially means deduced. As in, something has to be true if this, what I've just observed, is true. I'll say more. So Hegel introduces a paradigmatic example of an inferred concept already in the perception chapter. So I'll say a few words about that chapter, which is in between sense certainty and force and understanding. And then these inferred concepts are consolidated, as it were, in the understanding chapter, the final chapter of section A. Hegel's paradigmatic concept, paradigmatic inferred concept in the perception chapter is that of substance. The concept of substance is what allows us to organize the perceptual manifold. The overcrowding, metaphorically speaking, that occurs when, as in Hegel's own example, a piece of salt that's in front of you appears as white, but also cubical, also tart, and so on and so forth, all at once. Yeah, that's the overcrowding, the all at once part. That is to say, a piece of salt could not be all of these at once if it weren't in itself none of these, but something else that underlies all of these, right? Something else that underlies all of these properties. But that something else is also, I'll use Locke's language here, and in the next slide I will have some quotes from Locke. That something else, substance, is also a kind of a je ne sais quoi. What is this piece of salt, if not white, tart, cubical, and so on? If we don't use these descriptors, then we've got no other descriptors to describe the substance. So this tension also appears as early as Aristotle's categories, where he distinguishes between primary and secondary substance, something that he doesn't do in the metaphysics. And it is this tension that Hegel seizes on in the perception chapter, and that allows him, that carries us into the force and understanding chapter. So let me just read these quotes, which I don't have here, so I'll have to reposition myself a little bit. But then I want to have a mic. Actually, I do have a printout of the PowerPoint, so let me just try this. Okay, so this is, we're reading the first quote. Let me just read it quickly. It's a lot of fun. It is from Locke's very, very long essay on the human understanding, essay concerning human understanding. Okay, this is his critique of the notion of substance, right? If anyone will examine himself concerning his notion of pure substance in general, he will find he has no other idea of it at all, but only a supposition of he knows not what support of such qualities which are capable of producing simple ideas in us, right? Tart, white, red, etc. Which qualities are commonly called accidents. If anyone should be asked, what is the subject wherein color or weight inheres, he would have nothing to say but the solid extended parts. And if he were demanded, what is it that solidity and extension inhere in, he would not be in a much better case than the Indian before mentioned, who, saying that the world was supported by a great elephant, was asked what the elephant rested on, to which his answer was, a great tortoise. Is that, I never know how to pronounce this word, but it's on the screen. But being again pressed to know what gave support to the broad-backed tortoise, replied, something he knew not what. And thus here, as in all other cases where we use words without having clear and distinct ideas, we talk like children, who being questioned what such a thing is, which they know not, readily give the satisfactory answer that it is something. Okay, and now let me kind of bypass the middle quotation and read something from Aristotle's Categories, which I think also indirectly points to the same tension. Yeah? And then I'll read the middle quotation, which I think is the best one, and I'm quite proud of having found it. Of secondary substances, Aristotle writes, species is better called substance than genus. It is nearer to primary substance, while genus is more removed from it. Suppose someone asks you, what is it regarding a primary substance? So primary substance for Aristotle is this human being, right, an actual individual human being, whereas secondary substance would refer to the kind to which this human being belongs, right? But the kind of the interesting part here is that you can't talk about this human being other than by naming its secondary substance, right? It's a human being, but that's a universal, it's a general term, right? You're all human beings. So it's in a way, it's impossible to describe an individual human being in this individual human being's individuality or singularity. Okay. Your answer is both more instructive and also more apt to the subject, provided you mention its species than if you should mention its genus. Take this or that human being, for example. You would give a more instructive account if you stated the species or human being than you would if you called him an animal. The former belongs the more to him, the latter is somewhat too wide. Or again, take an individual tree. By mentioning the species or tree, you will give a more instructive account than by giving the genus or plant. Moreover, the primary substances most of all merit that name since they underlie all other things, right, just as in Locke, which in turn will be either their predicates or present in such as their subjects. And then here's the middle quotation. This is in a letter that Locke writes to someone whose last name is Bold. I'm not sure who that is. To try to phenomenalize substance per se as such, after all the phenomena presented by particular substances have been abstracted, right, red, white, etc., is to involve ourselves in an insurmountable difficulty of our own making. And I particularly like that Locke uses the term phenomenalize here, because in a certain way, the transition, Hegel's transition from perception to force and understanding is just that middle quote inverted. It is because we cannot ultimately phenomenalize, that is, make substance appear, that we have to think of it, and this is how force and understanding chapter begins, that we have to think of it as something that is impossible to phenomenalize, something that is not phenomenal, but is super phenomenal, that is super sensible, right? And then that's the point at which we are in the realm of the beyond for Hegel. Yeah. Okay. So what is immediate? In this case, substance per se, yeah, pure substance, just isn't cut out for this sublunary world of material change, to use Aristotle's nomenclature. It is unphenomenalizable, so it must withdraw into the supersensible beyond, the realm of pure understanding, the only conceivable alternative. In this way, the concept of substance is really rescued. Right? We would like it to remain essential, but it turns out to be inessential, in that it can only be described through its accidents, right? Again, tart, red, etc. Here below. Right? So it's inessential here below, which is just another way of saying that it's unphenomenalizable. So we have to place it, as it were, on a different shelf, a supersensible shelf, a shelf set so high, this is metaphorical language on my part, right? A shelf set so high as to be intentionally unreachable. Now, while Hegel's Force and Understanding chapter is widely regarded as the most difficult stretch of Hegel's writing, I would suggest the difficulties are mostly surface difficulties, and the underlying argument is fairly straightforward. Hegel picks the allegory of more or less Newtonian force for his argument, and it is vital to keep in mind that it is an allegory. It's not really about Newton that Hegel is talking about in the Understanding chapter. The allegory of force is an allegory for the relationship between postulated theoretical entities. Hegel calls these unconditioned universals, unconditioned because simply outside appearances, right? And he adopts the term from Kant. And the observable phenomena that make those entities inferentially accessible or possible. Think of gravity. We don't ever observe gravity itself. What we observe are apples falling from trees or planets tracing their orbits. From these observations, we infer the existence of a theoretical entity called force. But at the risk of a kind of a premature forward step, force is not something over and above its expression. It is only ever what shows itself in its expressions. Hegel's key move here is to frame this relationship as mimetic or even tautological. That's the term that he actually uses, tautology. And I don't mean it in a negative sense, for the most part at least. There is no force, in other words, without an expression of force. So the force versus expression distinction is, to use the language of the scholastics, it's a formal, not a real distinction. They have the same content doubled in form. Right? This is what Hegel means by tautology. Why do bodies gravitate toward the Earth, to stick to the Newtonian paradigm? Because they undergo gravitational force that has the property of expressing itself thus. And I emphasize thus because Newton's force also conveniently assumes the shape of law, right? Conveniently for computation. Stated otherwise, to postulate a theoretical object like force is to postulate a concept inferred from the whole range of appearances, a shorthand that is introduced in order to systematize empirical observations and facilitate prediction, retrodiction, and control. More concretely still, Newton's force is a shorthand for, right, column, we have observed bodies gravitate toward the Earth in this way, and we anticipate that under similar conditions, they will continue to do so in the future. That is all that force is, Hegel explains. Explanation just is, in the final reckoning, prediction. So Hegel's unconditioned universals, unconditioned because supersensible, supersensible because hiding, as it were, behind their own expressions, can be very useful at times, but they're still tautologies. The first quote, in this tautological movement, the understanding, as it turns out, sticks to the inner unity of its object, and the movement falls only in the understanding itself, not in the object. It is an explanation that not only explains nothing, but is so plain that while it prepares to say something different from what has already been said, it really says nothing, but only repeats the same thing. Yeah, I mean, Hegel is not really helping his case by writing like this, but this is, by the way, how Hegel accomplishes the transition from section A to section B. The transition from consciousness to self-consciousness occurs precisely when, in the tautology of explanation, consciousness glimpses itself. The second quote, we see that in the interior of appearance, what the understanding in truth gets to experience is nothing other than appearance itself. Only not appearance as it is as the play of forces, but rather the play of forces in its absolutely universal moment, so generalized, and in their movement. And in fact, the understanding experiences only itself. So in this way, Force and Understanding chapter really culminates in Hegel's own version of Kant's argument for transcendental idealism, right? It's only ever its own necessity that the understanding announces, right? That's the upshot. In other words, theoretical postulates like force are nothing more than patterns that the understanding finds and formulates in observable phenomena. That is to say, inferred theoretical concepts are creations of the understanding. Yet the purpose of Hegel's Force and Understanding chapter is also negative and critical in the Kantian sense of disciplining human cognition. Hegel's target in this chapter, the dialectical illusion that he seeks to expose, is something like objectification, equivalently reification, so making something that is not an object or a thing into a thing. Hegel sets out the mechanism of objectification in 143. However, once again as consciousness, it makes this, what is true, into what is objectively inner or interior, and distinguishes the reflection of things into themselves from its own reflection into self, in the way that in the eyes of consciousness, the mediating movement is still equally an objective movement. This inner thus is in the eyes of consciousness an extreme term facing it. So to paraphrase, what happens here in reification, that consciousness disowns the very explanatory act that yielded these unconditioned universals, its own act, treating these unconditioned universals as the objective inner or interior of appearances, existing independently of itself, a kind of extreme over against. And this is, by the way, what the originally object means, right? Something that you threw in front of yourself, object. In other words, Hegel critiques the dialectical illusion whereby consciousness projects universal as if they were independent objects. This is the mechanism of reification. So in a way, the tautologies of the understanding only pose a hazard when reified into supposedly actually existing objects beyond the sensible realm. They have to be beyond the sensible realm because otherwise you can't ever meet them in the sensible realm. So objects like force are virtual computational devices or instruments that ought not to be mistaken for really actually existing entities. Treating them as such means falling hostage to the trophies of prior victories. The generation of theoretical entities is a one-way street, so from appearances to the theoretical entities. And regarding them as themselves generative of appearances potentially obstructs future inquiry, though theories may in certain cases, of course, disqualify empirical observations. Now, in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant had already diagnosed this inexorable tendency of human cognition. In the paralogism section of the Critique of Pure Reason, for example, Kant argues that it is illegitimate to infer from the transcendental unity of our perception the existence of an immaterial, immortal soul. And in the ideal section of the dialectic, Kant extends the same criticism to the idea of God, arguing that this is really just the mind's own conceptual structures reified. I know I'm moving quickly here, much too quickly, but I want to draw your attention just one footnote in B611, deep in the dialectic of the first critique. Right, the second one. This ideal of the supremely real being, Kant writes, even though it is a mere representation, is first realized, made into an object, then hypostatized, and finally, as we will presently allege, through a natural progress of reason in the completion of unity, it is even personified. There's some debate in Kant's scholarship about what exactly these three stages mean, but here's how I understand them. Yeah? So realization or objectification means simply turning the concept into something that is, an ends. Yeah? Like Kant's postulated things in themselves, thinkable but not knowable. Hypostatization is running that object through the categories, as it were, treating it as one, as a substance, and so on. And finally, personification is attributing will and intelligence to this concept. This is how we get the, say, the providential God of Augustine, according to Kant, or the veridical God of Descartes. Now, Kant's attitude toward this reification is actually very ambivalent. Hegel even says that it's hypocritical and cowardly. This is towards the end of the spirit chapter of the Phenomenology. Kant admits that the idea of a providential God is just a projection and that it doesn't count as real theoretical knowledge. But he also insists that we can't do without it. It's a necessary fiction, Kant calls it a postulate, for practical life. As an aside, for Kant, God is a necessary fiction that cannot be dispensed with. For Hegel, by contrast, God is a true fiction from which the truth can be extracted while discarding the fictive element. In other words, Hegel thinks that whatever God is, it is possible to de-objectify it, rescuing the rational kernel, as it were, from theology's representationalism. This is what, say, Miller in his translation translates as picture thinking. And I mean, if you ask me, this is really what is at the heart of the Hegel versus Kant dispute. And so I've prepared these two quotes here, and then I'll come back to the previous slide. The first one is from The Religion book of Kant's, where he claims quite explicitly that religious faith, and he means religious faith in the future life here, it automatically imposes itself upon everyone by virtue of the universal moral predisposition in human nature, right? So this is I think, a kind of often a misunderstanding of Kant's position that I thought I would just kind of try to remedy. So when Kant presents what he calls the moral argument for God's existence, he's not really trying to persuade anyone that God exists. What the moral argument means is that whether you want it or not, you believe in God. At least that's how I understand what Kant is saying in his moral proof. Hegel's position is quite different, and it's also very interesting. So this is the first sentence of Absolute Knowing, the final chapter. So he's kind of summarizing what he did in the religion section. He says, and again, I won't be able to say much about this, but maybe this is something we can talk about in the question period. He says that the spirit of revealed religion has not yet overcome its consciousness as such, or what amounts to the same thing, its actual self-consciousness is not the object of its consciousness. The spirit itself in general and the self-differentiating moments within it fall into representation and into the form of objectivity. And what he means by objectivity here is not the kind of objectivity that we associate with, say, science, but it's making something into an object that is not an object, that should not be thought of as an object, as an entity. Okay, now, so going back to the previous slide, let me just outline Kant's attitude toward reification here. The one that Hegel says is hypocritical and cowardly. So, first, just the first quote. So since the world's otherness, whether natural forces or the actions of those with whom we have not coordinated, often divert our efforts and produce consequences beyond our control, Kant argues that human beings would fall into despair, a kind of a transcendental despair, if they did not postulate a providential God who orders events so that outcomes ultimately remain connected to intentions rather than futile, even if in the very long term. I mean, that's what providence means. Thereby preserving the very possibility of practical reason, right? In other words, without providence for Kant, practical reason it's dysfunctional. Right? And this is why Kant's practical doctrine requires a kind of a theological supplement. Kant mobilizes similar logic in his argument for the postulate of immortality, also in a second critique. Since the ideal of virtue that Kant prescribes, an ideal approaching Christian sainthood, cannot be realized within the limits of this earthly life, we must project an infinite supersensible duration for the soul in which we can conceive, at least, of the eventual attainment of holiness. So then, at best, I'm sort of paraphrasing Hegel's attitude. So at best, Kantian philosophy is metaphysics and scare quotes, right? So it describes a kind of situation where we're too enlightened to take something like the doctrine of providence or immortality at face value, but we still can't escape from it or drop it. Right? It's required for our brain functioning, so to speak. Yeah. At worst, Kantian philosophy has devolved into a system of moral self-help strategies, right? And actually, I think it's neither, right? But I'm not wearing my Kant hat for this lecture, so. Okay, Hegel's analysis of the unhappy consciousness is, at bottom, a critique of these metaphysical strategies and of the economy of desire that underlies them, the desire that seeks what lies beyond its reach. Hegel's fullest treatment of this economy of desire comes much later, in the spirit chapter of the Phenomenology, in his final engagement with Kant. So what I'm going to do here is read the unhappy consciousness chapter alongside that later discussion. So it's going to be a kind of a diametrical reading of the Phenomenology's spiral. Hegel's final engagement with Kant turns on a single concept, the concept of a postulate, originally Kant's term, which I've already used a few times. Hegel describes the postulate, what a postulate is, in the following terms. Again, so I'll start reading not from the very beginning of the quote. So the harmony of morality and happiness is thought of as necessarily existing. That is, as it is postulated. So this is so, since to make that demand is to express the following, right? So this is what the postulate is. That something is thought of as existing which is not yet actual. That is, a necessity not of the concept as concept, but of being. So what is postulated is the assurance that the desired object already exists, eternally realized in the supersensible realm, as a safeguard against the risk of acting. For the unhappy consciousness, the pure self, like the Stoics' ideal of independent thought, can be attained only in the beyond, via the rejection of the body. The body, the sinful body, is the enemy, in what he literally calls the enemy in the unhappy consciousness section. And so this is the second quote is Kant's official definition of the postulate, but okay, I'll skip it. Okay, so in 208, in the Unhappy Consciousness chapter, Hegel writes about this. This is how he describes the internally split consciousness that the unhappy consciousness is. So one of them, namely the simple unchangeable, is to it as the essence, but the other, the multiple changeable, is as the unessential. The two are for it essences that are alien to one another. And because it is itself the consciousness of this contradiction, it ranges itself on the side of the changeable consciousness, and is to itself the unessential. But as consciousness of unchangeableness, or of the simple essence, it must at the same time set about freeing itself from the unessential, freeing itself from itself. But as you might guess, freeing itself from itself is for Hegel a hopeless task, an impossible demand. So such is the twofold nature of postulating, and Hegel sees it. In seeking to confer actuality on the object of desire, consciousness secures that object as fixed, yet can do so only by projecting it into a beyond, thereby placing it outside the sphere of knowledge and action. But this warps, as it were, the very nature of action, perhaps even makes it impossible. Hegel's unhappy consciousness would rather have the false safety of certain failure, so the comfort of foreknown defeat, than face the risk of acting. Hegel's unhappy consciousness stems from a kind of a privative model of desire, right? So desire is lack of privation, again, recall Plato's Symposium. Pushed to its very limit. The desire that desires its own, lack. I'm close to finishing. Here's how Hegel renders this thought in the unhappy consciousness in 212. This is the second quote. The hope of becoming one with it, the it here refers to the unchangeable, must remain a hope, which is to say, it must remain without fulfillment, without ever being present. Between the hope and the fulfillment stands the absolute contingency or immovable indifference, which lies in the shape itself, that is, in the very basis of the hope. Now, if you're interested in what absolute contingency or immovable difference mean here, I'm happy to talk about this in the question period. And here's how he renders essentially the same thought much later in 603 in his engagement with Kant's metaphysics. The completion, therefore, is not actually attainable. He's talking about the Kant's postulate of the immortality specifically here. But is to be thought of only as an absolute task, as a task that simply remains a task. But while Kantian postulation, which is, again, the original form of postulation, culminates in endless striving, the failure of action in Hegel's unhappy consciousness assumes a more intricate shape. Hopelessness gives rise not to perseverance, a kind of an impossible eternal perseverance or striving, right? But to what we might, borrowing from psychoanalysis, call acting out, a kind of a futile acting out. A form of action that aims to fail quickly rather than to endure amid uncertainty. The clearest example of such acting out appears in 217, where Hegel exposes the futility of directing action toward the beyond. Since action only ever targets the singular, any attempt to treat the beyond as something that can be housed in a singular object, something to conquer or possess, is an effort to seize what has always already escaped. Hegel's cryptic reference to the grave in 217 is a compressed allusion to the Crusades, a critique that Hegel develops more fully in the Philosophy of History lectures. So let me quote from that. It's kind of a dramatic passage. I did a precept on the lectures, I think 2 years ago. So Hegel writes about the Crusades, right, as a kind of, for him, as an instantiation of what the attitude of the unhappy consciousness might result in. At last, with much trouble and immense loss, more regular armies attained the desired object. They beheld themselves in possession of all the holy places of note, Bethlehem, Gethsemane, Golgotha, and even the Holy Sepulchre. In the whole expedition, in all the acts of the Christians, appeared that enormous contrast, a feature characteristic of the age, the transition of the part of the crusading host from the greatest excesses and outrages to the profoundest contrition and humiliation. Still dripping with the blood of the slaughtered inhabitants of Jerusalem, the Christians fell down on their faces at the tomb of the Redeemer and directed their fervent supplications to him. A few pages later in the lectures, Hegel offers his rejoinder to this whole crusading attitude. The crusaders, he suggests, are like the women arriving in the sepulchre in Luke 24, only to find it empty. Right? Because the unchangeable cannot be housed in a material object. Two men stood by them in shining garments, like probably angels, and as they were afraid and bowed down their faces to the earth, they said unto them, "Why seek you living among the dead?" So which consciousness is unhappy? Let me offer something like a definition at this juncture. That consciousness is unhappy which projects its fulfillment as already accomplished, but only in some unreachable beyond. In Hegel's encyclopedia, he offers a remarkable gloss on Kant's critical system in its entirety. And it's also one of Hegel's funniest jokes, in my estimation. Hegel quips that critical philosophy resembles Scholasticus. And by the way, I should mention, even in the most recent Cambridge edition translation of the encyclopedia, Terry Pinker, who, by the way, is a really excellent scholar of Hegel, but for some reason, he translates Scholasticus, which is a proper name of a character in a Stoic text that had not survived, by Favorinus. I'll highlight these two quotes in a second. The Scholasticus proper name is translated just as plural, right, lowercase scholastics, which it doesn't really change anything about the logic, but I thought I would just kind of show you a little bit the genealogy of where this comes from, okay? Right, so critical philosophy resembles Scholasticus' wise resolution to learn to swim before he ventured into the water, right? Which Hegel probably borrows from Erasmus. I think it's translated as Proverbs into English. And Erasmus most likely borrows it from this Roman philosopher who wrote this text called Athenian Nights. Beautiful title, which is really a kind of a medley of things. I haven't really looked at this, but he attributes this proverb joke to the Stoic philosopher Favorinus. Okay, so insofar as Kant's critical philosophy, as I have sought to show, ends metaphysics only by placing it in quotation marks, Hegel's diagnosis extends to the entire metaphysical tradition. The resolution of Scholasticus, who is scared of venturing into the water, captures the unhappy privative model of desire and knowledge that underlies Hegel's unhappy consciousness. And if I may update Hegel's joke here, and perhaps this is how he himself understood it, this is why I'm providing the German here. This word in German could literally mean something like to wager. Pinker translates it as ventured, which is perfectly fine. So if I may update Hegel's joke, and perhaps this is how he himself understood it, Scholasticus's mistake was not merely in attempting to learn to swim on the shore before venturing into the water, but attempting to learn to swim tout court. Perhaps, had Scholasticus simply ventured, right, or again, wagered, perhaps something other than swimming might have occurred. And again, so my favorite version is Matthew. This is about Jesus, great Christ, walking on water. So I think this is the kind of philosophy of action that Hegel ultimately offers, right, in replacement of this Scholasticus's kind of metaphysical, let me learn to swim before I get into the water attitude. Yeah. Okay, so finally, my conclusion. So let me return, to conclude, to the concluding lines of the Phenomenology. We're back to where we started. Why end with a poetic quotation? Why Schiller's Freundschaft? And was Hegel's misquotation intentional, or just a memory glitch? And we probably, if it was a memory glitch, we probably shouldn't blame Hegel too much. He was finishing the Phenomenology under rather stressful conditions, as I'm sure some of you know. Jena was under Napoleon's siege. His housekeeper was pregnant with his child, and he was also living on advance payments. So, at the very least, next time you're tempted to take Hegel to task for his terrible prose, maybe cut him a little slack. But I would suggest that Hegel's misquotation is intentional, at least in what concerns the erasure of the hyphen and the insertion of the possessive his infinity. Yeah? For these two gestures directly echo, indeed fulfill, paragraph 5 of the preface, which, that's the first one on the slide. To help bring philosophy, et cetera, right, to end love of knowledge and to become actual knowledge, to become actually wise. Now, Hegel's erasure of the hyphen enacts the gesture of giving up the love of knowledge, where love names the condition of lack that separates human beings from wisdom, right? So the hyphen here acts as a kind of a gesture of separation, which then Hegel gets rid of. And Hegel's insertion of the possessive pronoun, his infinity, signals just that, the final possession of wisdom, the final having of wisdom. But wisdom itself has been transformed here. As is well known, Hegel's use of the term infinity is highly idiosyncratic. For Hegel, it signifies not an endless progression, but something like a structure of reflection. I mean, literally, like with a mirror, or even between two mirrors. It is a circle rather than a straight line. But think of it as a kind of a living circle where no part exists apart from the whole. A ring dance, for example, of the Eleusinian mysteries that both Hegel and Schiller were very interested in. Schiller has a poem about it. So in the Phenomenology, Sophia, wisdom, signifies no longer the vertical relation to the eternal and immutable, but the horizontal relation between autonomous beings. Wisdom conceived horizontally, and this is what Hegel ultimately means by absolute knowing, knowing that is absolved from all assumptions or external authorities, means that every judgment, every belief is open to revision, and nothing holds unconditional authority. So absolute knowing is knowing as universal. So as far as knowing is concerned, nothing ought to be next to knowing. Knowing, which is procedurally experience, ought to occupy the whole domain, right? This is what universality means, at least spatially conceived. To cancel vertical transcendence is then to recast wisdom as a horizontal project carried out in common. Someone like Dewey, who I think, someone who in the 20th century understood Hegel very, very well, would not hesitate to say that it's a kind of a democratic project. So it's a project carried out in common by experiment and experience, and thus unsustainable without a measure of philia, friendship or love. And perhaps that is why Hegel quotes this particular poem. Not only is it about friendship, which I would say, in Aristotle, for example, the horizontal relation par excellence, or at least the friendship of virtue. But it is also by Schiller, probably Hegel's favorite poet. Quoting him must have been for Hegel already a gesture of friendship. And this is how the spiral of the phenomenology comes full circle. So what begins as philosophy, as love of wisdom, concludes as a wisdom of or in love. And one last thing about the significance of love and friendship in Hegel. So I did this seminar on Schiller's poem 2 weeks ago, which in some way, at least in part, I did to have a clear conscience tonight, because I have not said almost anything about Schiller, intentionally. And so in that seminar, Ms. Burns was there, and Ms. Burns pointed out, she knows Schiller very well, Ms. Burns pointed out that Friendship is one of Schiller's very early youthful poems. And of course, Schiller himself was Hegel's great hero poet in Hegel's own youth. So when Hegel quotes Schiller, he is also in a way quoting his youth. And what is significant here, significant to the degree that phenomenology could have had love of friendship in its title, is that at 27, Hegel wrote a series of essays on Christianity. He was still a kind of theologian then, but with a twist, as it were. And in those writings, he describes what will later become spirit, or Geist, in the phenomenology, precisely in terms of love and in terms of friendship. So at the very end of phenomenology, Hegel is also making a return to his own youth and to the ideas of Christian love and friendship that animated his first attempts at thinking. Okay, so I'm quoting now, let me just read this kind of longish quote from The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate. This is which Hegel wrote when he was 27. Okay, so Hegel writes, "In the kingdom of God, what is common to all is life in God. This is not the common which a concept expresses, but is love, a living bond which unites the believers. It is this feeling of unity of life, a feeling in which all oppositions as pure enmities, and also rights as unifications of still subsisting oppositions are annulled." Okay. By the way, I mean, it's kind of a fun definition of right that he provides here. It's very smart. It's a unification of subsisting oppositions. Okay, then he quotes John 13:34. "A new command give I unto you, that you love one another. Thereby shall men know that you are my disciples." This friendship of soul, the word friendship is there in German, described in the language of reflection as an essence, as spirit, is the divine spirit, is God who rules the communion. Is there an idea more beautiful than that of a nation of men related to one another by love? Is there one more uplifting than that of belonging to a whole, which as a whole, as one, is the Spirit of God whose sons the individual members are? Was there still to be an incompleteness in this idea, an incompleteness which would give fate power over it? Or would this fate be the nemesis raging against a too beautiful endeavor, against an overleaping of nature? And then he starts a new paragraph. "In love, man has found himself again in another." In the Phenomenology, Hegel no longer says that Geist is Liebe, but the structure of love remains the structure of spirit. In the same way, the structure, what love is to spirit, forgiveness is to absolute knowing. So compare Hegel's Liebe quotation from The Spirit of Christianity and Its Fate to how Hegel describes spirit, importantly, in the idiom of reflection as opposed to the idiom of revealed religion, which for Hegel is still entangled in representational thought. Recall the first sentence of the Spirit chapter, in 177 of the Phenomenology. And I'll just read this quote and I'll end with that. So 177. "The concept of spirit is thereby on hand for us. What will later come to be for consciousness will be the experience of what spirit is. That is, this absolute substance, or essence as Wesen, which constitutes the unity of its oppositions in their complete freedom and self-sufficiency, namely, in the oppositions of the various self-consciousnesses existing for themselves, the I that is we and the we that is I." I'm grateful for your patience.